And without further ado, let's get on to my very special, very first guest. It is political commentator James Melville, who, as a trained observer, I've noticed in the past that may well be Scottish. Welcome, James.
I still am Scottish. Good to see you again.
You too. Where have you been all my life?
I've missed you.
Yeah, you too, mate. You too, mate. Listen, you're just the guy for this. I want to talk to you generally about, the state of the nation as we see it right now. But first of all, let's talk about, well, I'm going to call him your former leader, Humza Yousaf, who basically checked out in a wave of feeble hopelessness this morning, didn't he? I mean, this was a guy who prioritised his own woke vanity over the necessities and the needs of the Scottish people. A man who looked down on his own people because they weren't woke enough, because they didn't think perhaps that male rapists should go into female prisons, and so on and so forth. He is exactly the sort of politician that not only Scotland should get rid of, so should England, so should Wales. He's a metaphor of these times, a story of these times, isn't he?
He completely is on a number of different levels. I mean, I know he hoisted himself up in his own petard, what happened with the Greens. But there's a combination of things. That was almost the straw that broke the camel's back for many of the reasons you've just mentioned. The SNP, whether you like them or not, the old SNP understood, whether you agree with independence or not, understood that freedom was for the people, and they listened to the people. That's why they won consecutive elections. They were an election-winning machine. They captured and understood the mood of the majority of Scottish people. The new wave SNP have completely forgotten about that, and that is why they're struggling. And that's why they're going to pay a heavy price at the general election, the Scottish election, whenever that is. It might be quite soon, depending on vote no confidence and so on. But Humza is an encapsulation of that. Some of the policies that he was front and centre in terms of being involved with, such as gender identification, combined with aspects on net zero, and then the Hate Crime Act, I think that was the final straw in terms of legislation, meant that he was on the way, and he didn't resonate with the Scottish people. Now, the Scottish people, like the rest of the UK, I think roughly want the same things in terms of values. They want smaller government, but they want more effective government. And they want government and politicians who actually take the time and place to remember what they're there for, to serve the people and listen to the people is the first aspect of serving the people. He completely lost sight of that. I think he'll go down in history as the most inept, the most stubborn, and probably the worst First Minister Scotland have had in the history. And he deserves all of that. And I listened to some of his speech today, and yes, he almost broke down in tears, but it's too late. There's no sympathy from me and many people in Scotland, because they have taken their eye off the ball with these woke policies. Meanwhile, standards are slipping in Scotland in education and in health, in terms of transport. I mean, I was up in Scotland recently. I visited 2 or 3 of the town centres. It's the same problem in many other parts of the UK. They're rotting.
Yeah.
The fundamentals of infrastructures and public services are failing in Scotland, and that is because the Scottish Government have forgotten about the concerns of their very own people.
There was an excellent piece by Brendan O'Neill on Spiked Online yesterday, in which he, I think, correctly pinpointed the problem with Humza and politicians like him. Nicola Sturgeon was far more practically talented, a better organiser, but she suffered from the same wokery. It was this idea that as the First Minister of Scotland, it's your job to educate the people of Scotland, to stop them being so full of hatred and transphobia and homophobia. It isn't their job to do that. As you say, that hate bill, was it 2 weeks ago, was spectacularly illiberal. A law that prevents people saying what they want to do in their own homes. That is North Korean. Yep. People like Humza Yousaf, they think they're liberal and, right on and cutting edge. They're not. They're fascists who want to control people, stop people thinking what they want to think, saying what they want to think. That is the problem with people like Humza Yousaf. His own virtue-signalling vanity was far more important to him than the needs and requirements of the Scottish nation.
Yeah, it was Orwellian by the end. I mean, the change of the SNP over the years is extraordinary. You know, as you know, Kevin, I'm sympathetic to the independent cause because I fundamentally believe in freedom and freedom for the people and the right to choose, the freedom of expression, the freedom of choice. You know, political aspects obviously become part of that. And so In terms of sovereignty, everyone should have the right to choose. But this Scottish government, while they're claiming that they want freedom and independence, the recent model of the SNP, of which Humza is a massive part of that, seem to give up the impression they only want freedom for one thing, and that's freedom for themselves to indulge in forms of authoritarianism. And yet they are the illiberal liberals. I say this as someone who's a lifelong liberal. I know what liberalism is, and it's certainly not this. This is about, it was shown over the COVID aspect, which the alarm bells were ringing in terms of the draconian measures that the Scottish government were implementing then, always a little bit more draconian that was going on at Westminster, always announced a few days later. But it's got a lot worse in the last few weeks with some of the measures. You know, in terms of gender identification and also the Hate Crime Act, these are two appalling measures that are not in keeping with the desires and the wishes or the concerns of the vast majority of people in Scotland. The time that I've spent in Scotland, I've spent a lot of time in Scotland, is most people have walked away from where the SNP are right now, and they need to have a hard look at themselves and actually remember why they were popular in the first place. And not all of that was about independence. It was about good governance. You know, over a decade ago, but they've lost sight of that now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? At the SNP, the Scottish National Party, it's about independence. He seems to have forgotten all about it because independence has become a difficult concept for the SNP after Nicola's failures in legal land, failure to get a second referendum. They can't have another referendum, certainly for some time. I mean, I agree with you, James. If there's a referendum, I don't think now is the time, certainly not now, but if there's a referendum in the future, I think probably the quite distant future, and the Scottish people decide they want to go independent, then I'm a Democrat. I think they should do that. But now is not the time because the SNP, because it was unable to get anywhere near bringing about its reason for existence, that is Scottish independence, it fell back on this ludicrous wokery. He, as you say, he dealt this death blow to himself with this fantastically illiberal fascistic hate law. And of course, following on, that was from Nicola Sturgeon, who wrote her own death certificate by putting male rapists into women prisoners. I mean, what is wrong with these people? Don't they understand? Scottish people are great people. They're not going to put up with that nonsense.
No, I mean, one thing I know about the Scots is we have an independent streak, not just about Scottish independence, but about wanting to just live our lives with minimum involvement from state interference, but understanding that government has to be there to protect those who need it most. And instead, what we've got is we've got big government in Scotland implementing a set of policies that aren't in keeping with the culture and society in terms of the objectives and the concerns of people in Scotland, combined with an approach that they're not listening to the concerns of people in Scotland. Now, there is parallels with this in terms of what's going on at Westminster or what's going on in Wales. We have now 3 different governments in Scotland, England and Wales, different parties, but fundamentally with the same problem. They're not listening to the concerns of the people, and instead they're indulging in these authoritarian, almost like, we'll show you who's boss, and rather than serving, they're ruling, but ruling with measures that really are not moving the country forward in the right direction. They're taking it into a rather disturbing situation. And meanwhile, the important things like our infrastructures, our public services, the ability to have the freedom to protest, the freedom to speak, the freedom to go about business, the protection of our small businesses. I could run a conveyor belt of issues, but they've forgotten about these issues. And instead they're indulging in these bizarre issues that the vast majority of people are just either not bothered about or they're concerned by. They're getting governed by a small but very vocal minority who are driving the agendas, not just in Scotland, but in Wales and at Westminster, in a direction that most of the British people do not want. And this comes on to the general election. We've got, whether it's in Scotland or whether it's a general election in Westminster, we've got a set of parties that no one looks at them and think, actually, I get what they're trying to do here. They're listening to, they've got an agenda here that I buy into. Instead, we've got a set of parties that are completely out of sync with the concerns and the issues facing millions of people across this country. And Humza is a perfect example of that. He is a perfect encapsulation of a politician who's so out of sync with the needs of this country.
Yeah, I mean, I don't say this lightly. I think he was an idiot. I think he was an absolute idiot, you know, who just didn't understand his job. And how dare he leave the scene by branding the Scottish people full of hatred and racism. That's what he said. You know, still full of racism, hatred. Look, people like Humza Yousaf, or for that matter, Nicola Sturgeon, if they want to know about racism, visit Britain in the 1960s. Or the 1950s. That was racism. People were racists then. They're not now. They're not. Yeah. This country has changed beyond belief, and people like Humza Yousaf are trying to drum up the racism of the past. They're the ones who are causing all this problem. The problems are not really there.
Yeah, it's identity politics and it's divide and rule, isn't it? It's the same old problem. I think Britain, you know, we should turn the debate on its head. I think you touched on something right at the start. I think Britain is generally one of the most tolerant, open-minded countries in the world. We've got a lot of problems, but those problems are caused by our politicians, largely not caused by the people. But what's happening is that, you know, whether it's in the debate on net zero, whether it's to do with immigration, whether it's to do with the gender identification program, whether it's to do with hate crime, these policies are causing division. But the division is causing division because people don't really know who to turn to, because they can't believe these policies are happening. So quite often they're squabbling amongst their communities themselves and on social media. But actually, they should be turning their attention to the root cause of these problems, and that is our politicians, and that is our governments who are pointing in the wrong direction and are governing by identity governance, not governments to improve the infrastructures and public services of this country. And that should be their job.
James, I've got to go to break now, but I want to ask you a quick question. I've got to ask you to answer it quickly. What next for the SNP? It doesn't matter what leader they have. I don't think that matters. I just think they face a really serious existential problem, possible wipeout by Labour. Even some Tory seats might go away from the SNP. I mean, Sturgeon and Yousaf between them have managed to put pay to what was at one point an astonishing political success story.
Yeah, I mean, it's complete self-destruction. They didn't need to do that. You know, they had legacy. They had a lot of skin in the game. They had solid constituencies. And that was largely to do with the combination of that solid base of independent supporters, but also quite good governance and certainly an understanding to convey their message and communicate well with the Scottish people. They've lost all that. But to answer your question quickly, I think they will lose a significant number of seats in the general election. I think they will lose a lion's share in terms of Holyrood. And in terms of the next leader, they either go a safe pair of hands, someone like Swinney, but then, as Joanna Cherry was pointing out, she expresses their reservations with this because that's nothing new. And meanwhile, the Scottish public are finding out tonight that, you know, Humza is going to walk away with 50% of his First Minister salary. So he's going to, in terms of pensions, so he's going to get 52 grand a year. So people look at all that and think, well, where is the change? I think the SNP need to change. They need to get a new individual who represents where the SNP want to go in the future, rather than looking over the shoulder and sleeping with the past.
Yeah, I just think Humza Yousaf is a symbol of everything that's wrong with modern Britain. A woke idiot who doesn't care about people. He just cares about his own virtue-signaling vanity. James, we'll get you back on very soon. Great to have you back on board. That was the brilliant political commentator, James Melville.